So it's a real pleasure today to have Sean Luyk from University of Alberta guiding us in a listening practice. I'm Jason Camelot, Director of Spoken Web, and we've been doing these listening practices now for quite a long time. And it's an opportunity for someone to bring some sounds and have us think about them, frame them for us in certain ways, and have a conversation. So unless Sean wants to direct us in more particular ways, I'll say feel free to, add comments in the chat, maybe stay muted when he does his opening remarks or different remarks, but then we're here to converse as well. So let us know if you have a question or want to add something, use the chat to do that. And I'll be happy to sort of DJ the squares for Sean and call on people if he misses someone. Um, so Sean is digital projects librarian at the University of Alberta. And he's also engaged in a research project related to local music collecting, which is a sort of cool thing that he's up to right now. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and nice to see everyone here. I'm really happy to be doing this. I've been the opportunity was there for a while, and I finally kind of got the courage to do one. I've been thinking about what to do for a session on, listening practices session, and there's been something I've been interested in for a really long time, which is Cantometrics, which is a system developed by Alan Lomax for sort of classifying, analyzing, and cataloging traditional song styles from around the world. So I'll share my screen first so we can get the slides up. And I just have a few opening remarks to get us going, and then it'll be all listening. So so I'm really interested in this concept of sort of listening to audio textual genres sort of in musical ways and in specifically looking for vocal production. So one thing you may not know about me, I do some choral singing. My wife is a choral director. So I've learned a lot about sort of how people use their voices, how we talk about this, how we teach people to use their voice in different ways. And I'm interested in systems to teach people really how to listen to voices in particular. And one that has really been interesting for years to me, it started as an undergrad sort of browsing the stacks. And I said, what is this thing called Cantometrics, right? So this big box with 8 cassette tapes, a big manual, these sort of graph-like things like this. And since I've had more interest in this project, I decided I'd digitize the Cantometrics training tape. So I'll tell you a little bit about Cantometrics and sort of what this project was trying to do. And then I think what we'll be doing is listening to some of the Cantometric training tape excerpts. Originally, I'd thought, well, let's listen to some literary audio. I don't think I'm there yet with my thinking. I think it'd just be interesting to listen to Alan Lomax kind of describing different elements of vocal production. So Cantometrics was developed by Alan Lomax and Victor Grauer. So for anyone who doesn't know Alan Lomax, he was a really influential folklorist, song collector, ethnomusicologist in the United States that made a huge impact on both ethnomusicology and musicology. And Cantometrics was sort of the culmination of his study of song styles around the world. And what he was looking at doing was comparative analysis. And this stemmed from, there's a tradition that sort of a precursor to ethnomusicology was a discipline called comparative musicology. So this is a very sort of 19th century kind of focused discipline that did a lot of cataloging, collecting, preserving, comparing, right? So this disciplinary background was really looking at how can we compare the cultures of the world. So some of you may have heard of something called the Human Relations Area Files, which was developed out of Harvard, I believe, which was essentially a large card catalog of different cultural features that they would tag on things like ethnographies. So this heavily influenced Cantometrics, and Lomax and Grauer developed Cantometrics as a way to look at different song styles around the world and really listening to particular vocal qualities. So things like different elements of timbre, different elements of rhythm, melody, different elements of how groups coordinate. So coordination between members of a vocal group. And this was developed into 37 what are called Cantometric scales, which you see on my screen here. So essentially the idea was once you were trained on how to do Cantometric analysis, you would listen to a song and you would code different areas for different elements. And I think this idea is just really fascinating to me because it was very based on, it was kind of trying to be very scientific and empirical, right? So it was trying to be quite quantitative about what you're hearing, sort of across a scale. They even went as far as doing statistical analysis to do some sort of clustering and grouping of different elements to compare. They made some leaps that we wouldn't, it's very 1960s, 70s academia, right? So there are a lot of leaps of like, they correlated things like nasality, for example, is the famous one. The level of nasality in women's singing, they said, well, that's correlated to societies where women have limited sexual freedom, for example, right? So there are a lot of these kind of correlations between social cultural factors and musical factors. So that part I'm not as interested in, although it is really interesting, some of the things that they came up with, right, which were very, interesting correlations, but obviously things, simplifications in a lot of ways, and eliminating some cultural factors that you need to consider. But the interesting part, I think, is how Cantometrics developed a system for listening. So someone like me who really started learning in Western art music, you learn about music mostly through text, mostly through score study. So when you do a music degree, you do score study, you do listening, memorization, typically identification. You do listen to sound for things like texture and timbre and melody and rhythm, but it's very sort of Western art focused, whereas Cantometrics was supposed to be applicable sort of around the world, right? Because what they wanted to do in this project was build on Lomax's idea of the global jukebox, which many people would have heard, which is he really had a real desire to catalog the music of the world and find ways for people to explore that music. Was very very interested, very strong proponent of multiculturalism and diversity, collectivity in societies. So Cantometrics was this really honest attempt, I think, to find ways to teach people how to listen. And really interestingly too, is he wanted people to be able to learn how to listen to music from around the world without knowledge of that music, right? So you could listen to anything. If you don't understand the language or the musical traditions, could you hear how much nasality there was in the singing style, or how much rasp there was in the voice? So I think this idea is so fascinating. And there's things that he included in, there's many Cantometric factors that don't really apply, or maybe are a little bit too far off from audio textual genres, but just to list some, and we'll listen to some today. So obviously vocal pitch or register, vocal width, which I'll play an example of in a bit, which is how open or closed someone's voice is. So how open their vowels are, or how you could say how tall their vowels are. Rasp, accent, so accent and attack. Enunciation, so how enunciated or slurred people's words are. And these Cantometric scales were further organized into these what are called style factors. So the idea is you'd listen to a traditional song, apply all these scales, and you'd get what's called a style profile for each song. So I think this is just a really interesting idea, not necessarily to directly apply to something like spoken web, but just to look at a system that is trying to make sense of how you listen in sort of a structured way. And you learn other examples are things like Armory Schaefer developed a system called ear cleaning, which is these training exercises for learning how to unlearn, let's say, Western biases towards listening and listen to the sound in the environment. This is sort of along the same lines. It's trying to be objective and try to give sort of agency to the listener to kind of make these determinations. So the listening part that comes out of this is that the Cantometrics book came with training tapes. So it's Alan Lomax narrating, explaining these different Cantometric scales with examples. And there's even tests at the end, which are interesting. So he'll describe all the different levels, and then he'll test you, and then there's answers in the book. So I thought it was just such an interesting idea. We just had to listen to it because I've been dying to listen to these for years. So, you know, on the other side, of course, this was critiqued quite a bit by the ethnomusicology community for the sort of those correlations that were made between sound and culture. But I think it's been, I mean, this type of thing, this idea that the social cultural conditions of someone who's singing or speaking have an impact on the sound of their voice, I think has a lot of traction. And then when I was doing some research on this, I don't know if anyone knows the Sounding Out blog, probably Jason. Yeah, there's a great blog post from 2015 by Maria P. Chavez Datza, and she writes that, quote, marginalized bodies produce marginalized sounds to communicate things that escape language. So I thought that was just a beautiful, really summation of actually some of the things that are said in Cantometrics, right? He was trying, Lomax and Grau were trying to look at cultural factors as determinants on musical style, essentially. So I think applied to poetry, this is really interesting. And in this blog post, what they're really discussing is sort of this idea of sonic affect in queer communities. And we're looking at this concept of tremble in the voice. So it's a really, really great blog post. I can send it out after, of different things, the idea that different things you do with your voice are sort of politically and culturally charged, I think is very powerful. So what we'll do now is I have a number of examples from the Cantometrics training tapes. And I think what we'll do is we'll see how it goes. I probably have more examples than we have time for, but we'll listen to each of them and kind of just listen for what he's trying to get at in the recordings. He's really describing the scale, and then we'll kind of break at each clip and discuss. So, and of course, yeah, as Jason said, anything you want to put in the chat, feel free. I think it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on this. So I think I may need to, let's see, I'll play this and see.
Many good songs, like this Irish diddling tune, consist altogether of nonsense syllables repeated over and over. In fact, one outstanding trait of song, and one of the most important measures of song style, is the amount of nonsense or repetition in the texts. For example, many songs have passages of yodeling. Others have yells or calls or animal imitations. These are all part of the non-lexical, nonsense load of songs, along with the straight repetitions of strings of meaningless but very singable syllables. This Irish lilt is obviously very repetitious. The following Negro spiritual, in which the chorus always sings the same refrain words, and the leader responds with a fresh line, is about 50% repeats and 50% new words.
Take one brick out, sit on the wall. Sit on the wall, come tumbling down. Hush, little baby, don't you cry. You're your mother born to die. Our Lord come by the rainbow sign.
Surprisingly, the reader doesn't have to know the language in order to make rather consistently good judgments about the degree of repetition or wordiness in a song style. This Yiddish chant, for example, is always rated as very repetitious, even by those who don't know Yiddish. This Spanish song is rated extremely wordy, with little or no repetition, whether or not the listener knows Spanish. You'll now hear examples of the 5 levels of repetition or wordiness in order. Level 1, extremely wordy, little repetition of text. Level 2, quite wordy. Some, perhaps about a quarter of the text, is repeated. Level 3, half wordy, about half repeats or nonsense. Level 4, quite repetitious, about 2/3 repeats. Level 5, extremely repetitious, mostly repeats or nonsense.
So you kind of get the idea there of sort of what the approach was. I'll just pause the share for a moment. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this? I can say first too, it's really interesting. I didn't include this in any slides or anything, but he says at each Cantometric scale, there's a little paragraph that kind of sums up what they found in their research. So it says repetitions of some text are more frequent in simple socioeconomies, less frequent in more complex socioeconomies. This variation seems to be indicative of the way that the level of new information and communication shifts with the general complexity of productive processes essential to a culture.
few basic start off in observations, I guess. As a mode of listening practice, so it was highly descriptive, categorical, very focused on its sound, only of speech, of voice sounds, right? Because almost all the samples you played us also had other repetitive sounds that were non-voice sounds, right? So if you were to include percussive sounds or instrument sounds or whatever, then yeah, that would change things significantly. Also extremely relational in its categorizations, right? So going from very wordy to half wordy, to extremely nonsensical versus sensical, that kind of thing. So the continuum or the gradation, I found it was kind of amusing, but at the same time very descriptive in its orientation. And then, of course, the obvious thing is what's being compared is very eclectic culturally, right? So that there's it's very, it's kind of anthropological in this strange sense of just, thinking of all these different cultural sounds in relation to each other. So, and they were great examples, all of them, like for the descriptive problem that was being presented.
Yeah, it's a real grab bag, right, of the examples. And this is from over, I think it's 4,000 songs. From part of the motivation for this too was the amount of fieldwork recording that was available at the time. So this is drawn from fieldwork Lomax did, which was extensive, but lots of other anthropologists and ethnomusicologists did. So yeah, so I mean, the repetition ones I thought was striking too for nonsense, like words we wouldn't call something nonsense, even nonsense syllables. That's kind of something we don't say anymore, right? So yeah, but quite descriptive. And yeah, what is it comparing itself? Where's the benchmark? Like, how do you know? Is that based on Western conceptions or?
Yeah, I bristled at the term meaningless, especially as applied to chanting and animal sounds, of course, which is going to be more prevalent in like indigenous or African music, perhaps. So definitely some culturally bound judgment there. I mean, how could you say the sound of a coyote is meaningless if the song is about a coyote going on a journey or something, right? So obviously, like, even though it's not a word, it still has meaning in terms of establishing the theme or emoting from the perspective of a coyote, something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to pile on in terms of the value judgments of some of the terms used.
Especially when you think of that idea of cultural complexity. I mean, our culture has we will rock you, and we're happy with that. So.
Yeah, just a comment, good comment from Tomasz in the chat that I just responded to, which is, yeah, hesitation from applying it to audio texts. I guess I wonder, so I was looking at things. I originally wanted to compare and say, let's play like rasp or nasality or pitch or something, and then find some examples of, where different poets go all over the place. But I couldn't find. I found, I found some deviation, but I found a lot of things are, they're it's meant to be intelligible. I think, at least what I understand, what I know about poetry, to be intelligible, understandable. I know certain styles have different, certain styles kind of go outside of that and play with like beat poetry and things like that. But so I'm interested in, asking you too, what as people who study poetry and think about poetry, like, where does this fit? Where doesn't it fit? Because for singing styles, I mean, I think probably Lomax picked singing styles because most cultures have some sort of singing style. But yeah, poetry, I wonder, like, is this something useful for kind of, especially in the spoken web sort of corpus, if you think of the time period and how people are speaking, at least what I've listened to at Spoken Web Alberta. There's lots of things with less variance, but yeah, just open that up for discussion and comment.
Well, I think that depends obviously a lot on the corpus involved. And so when I start to think about a variability, I think about different, in particular, avant-garde traditions through the 20th century. So from Dadaist poets, Kurt Schwitter's kind of work and that sort of thing, through other forms of spoken word performance. There's increasing variability in quite a bit of that in different contexts. But it is true, you're right, about within particular frameworks of kind of sanctified poetic performance, it tends to be quite restricted and quite narrow at different points in time. But then it's always, in that case, then there's always interesting cross-cultural or historical comparisons to be made, I think, in some respects. But yeah, if the corpus is Western Canadian prairie poets, they're going to be very similar by and large, or at least the ones coming through the university system that have passed a certain kind of ideological sieve along the way as well too. So, you know, it depends, I guess I would say, a little bit, but it's a fascinating idea. I agree with the suspicion around the extrapolations that happen here in terms of kind of cultural homogeneities and comparisons, but I'm always interested in these projects of the great systematizers of the structuralist traditions in different ways. And, you know, so you think about efforts to do comparative religion work or other kinds of global projects that are ethnographic at their heart. They're all fraught in very different ways, but there's interesting helping us to understand how systems break down and how those structures, in fact, are always blind to their own centering principles in different ways. So.
Just make one brief comment, which is, yeah, I mean, these types of things have had huge influences. It's kind of funny how they come back, I think. Sort of what I alluded to at the beginning, that I think in some ways this idea that, yeah, culture, social and cultural factors may influence people's voices, how they use them is kind of coming back in interesting ways. But yeah, also what we could do, thinking in the context of like audio signal analysis, a lot of the things Lomax would have wanted to do, we can see, right? You can see timbre, right? So if you want to see, so a common thing is, at least a musical metaphor, is a bright tone versus a dark tone, right? So you can see that, right? You can see on the spectrogram, you can see which partials are illuminated on a spectrogram. The higher partials are illuminated on a bright, with a bright voice, and the lower ones, of course, it stays closer to the fundamental on a dark tone. So just really interesting to see, like, they're doing this with like punch cards, right? Like it was a statistical analysis with punch cards. I also like the idea of not just throwing things in a computer and saying, let deep learning figure it out, like have human intervention. It was critiqued for having sort of intuitive, what they called like intuitive observations, right? But I think that's some of the most interesting things. Like for me, I think it's all about intuition, right? What you're hearing and what you're able to do as a person that maybe a computer can't. So yeah, Jason.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to think about what applications these particular listening categories, like listening for a continuum of repetition in relation to nonsense, or repetition and nonsense, right? For poetry, I think as a formal exercise, it could be very interesting. And I think sort of Mike's point about, we imagine going towards avant-garde, say sound poetry, other kinds of poetry where we're moving away from semantic communication in speech, right, would be one way to imagine that continuum, right? But I mean, I was teaching in my literature and sound studies course last week, Poe's The Bells, right, which was a very popular 19th century recitation poem, which literally has the word bells, repeat itself like 10 times. There's a line that repeats from stanza to stanza, the tintinnabulation that so musically wells from the bells, 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 right? From the jingling and the tinkling of the bells. And the bells, that word is repeated stanza to stanza, right? So I think there's repetition that's happening, throughout the poetic tradition to different ends. But if you were to do a computer analysis of, searching for repetition, that might put, Poe right next to Gertrude Stein or something like that, and you might come up with some very interesting formal recategorizations of poetries and what they're doing. But that, I guess it comes back to that other point about placing repetition in different kinds of contexts. Like I would say that repetition in Poe is both about evacuating the meaning of that word and turning it into a resonant sound that we identify with the object that it's supposed to be mimetically identified with. Like so really disrupting the relationship between signifier and signified by turning it into a resonance that's supposed to be associated with that thing that makes the sound. But also it was an opportunity for virtuosic elocutionary performance. So in a cultural context, that repetition was really about showing off, you know, how many weird, interesting things you could do with your voice on that single word, right? You know, and you could say probably that's the case for some of the repetition in the samples that we heard as well, right? That it's, you know, to do the repetitions and they're complex rhythmic repetitions, like there's a lot of virtuosity in being able to perform repetition in those ways, right? You know, so anyways, I'm just interested in sort of, as a formal exercise, I think there's a lot that could come out of doing it, you know. But then I guess my own inclination is always then to ground, well, what does it mean in the context of reception and use, you know, because repetition can mean so many different things. So yeah, it's fun though.
I'll say too, it's kind of fun to do a little home digitization project. You can buy these crappy little cassette digitizers on Amazon now for $30. And so that the sound quality may vary, but I did get some good captures off some of them, but so there's a few left in terms of options. So we've got glottal is kind of an interesting one to listen to. Vocal width, which I think I'll just tell you a little bit about vocal width, because this might be really interesting in the context of audio textual genres. I'll just get the definition here. Because he explains it. Sometimes he explains, sometimes he's showing, you know, what they found out, what social cultural factors these song styles revealed. And other times he's explaining to you what those features are. So for vocal width, I'll just get my slide open here. I'll just read that to you. That's a particular, it says this measure concerns the contrast between the voices which sound mellow, relaxed, and richly resonant. We call this wide, and the voices which sound tense, pinched, and restricted in resonance, which we call narrow. Many ways of vocalizing, like everyday American speech, are neutral in width. These we call mid. So that's sort of what I was talking about with, yeah, certain kinds of poetry that you know, I've been listening to just in the spoken word collection from a particular period sound very mid to me. There doesn't sound to be a lot, you know, huge amount of resonance in the voice. It sounds very, you know, straight ahead kind of to me. So we could do that one. And then the other one is we've got accent and enunciation. So any preferences or votes on which one to listen to? You want me to pick?
Width.
Width?
Yeah, I like the wide,
Width.
narrow one, just because it seems to have to do with affect a lot more than the others. So
yeah, we got other votes for glottal and accent. So
yeah.
we'll put those as our next one. So let's do vocal width then. So I'll share my screen again. And this one does not have fantastic audio quality, unfortunately. There's wow and flutter, which I can't fix with free tools. So
in this training tape for vocal width, we deal with the effect of vocal tension or relaxation on the quality of singing. A singer may produce a note with a very tight, squeezed, narrow tone, wider and more open, narrow and squeezed, more open. Now here is the singer brilliantly using a narrow voice. This singer uses a more open, wider voice. Listen now to further examples of the extreme levels of vocal width. First narrow and then wide. Here's an example of the midpoint in the scale, a voice which is neither narrow and tense, nor wide and clear. Mid. Now let's hear the three levels of vocal width in order. First, narrow. Second, mid.
A little hard, getting worse and worse to hear, but you get kind of the idea what he's trying to get at with that. Yeah, I thought it was interesting sort of listening to sort of this idea of width, right? I would talk, sometimes I think of, from the singing tradition, you talk about bright and dark, or you talk about strident, or is a word often used for a particular, or metallic, or, there's different ones. But yeah, how much stress is someone using in their voice, and how much is that tied to, I guess I wondered about how much that might be tied to language. He doesn't seem to talk about that too much, but yeah, sound is warble. Yeah, it was kind of picking up other sides of the tape. So continued celebration of the Beatles' White Album.
My expectation before you started playing it was that it was going to be all about affect, and that, a wide voice would be a joyous, sort of relaxed, happy voice, and a narrow voice would be an angry or a nervous voice, right? And then as soon as you started playing the samples, because again, they're eclectic and where they come from, I realized how culturally biased that idea was, because I think the narrow singing techniques, some of which we heard, weren't necessarily communicating or meant to communicate those affects that I was associating with the wide versus narrow at all, right? So I thought that's just sort of an initial observation on how I was schooled pretty quickly by the examples that were played.
Yeah, and I didn't show the scale, but it goes from like narrow to yodel, actually, literally. So the widest is really, he calls yodel or bugle tone, which is kind of interesting. But and I think he's talking about a really open sound, where there's lots of space in your mouth. That's really what he's actually talking about. So in singing, you might talk about that as tall vowels, or versus something that would be spread vowels, which is how most Canadians talk, right? Especially in the West. So so, and I see Mike has a comment here too. Or gendered. This is filled with gendered concepts in Cantometrics too, about what's more common for, I think even with vocal width, I think he talks about that of the narrowing, I think has to do with power, right? So women have more power in societies, they'll sing with more open tones, which is an interesting idea. I don't know if it's true, but it's an interesting kind of analysis of that constraint is kind of is heard in the voice, right, too.
I was just wondering too, like where on these scales would we put, say, Martin Luther King versus Noam Chomsky?
Yeah, like two different examples of speech, right? That have different levels of openness, probably Martin Luther King would probably be quite open, I'm guessing, quite resonant.
Can I ask a question, Sean? Going back to the original chart that you showed us, so these would be some categories that could be tracked on the chart? So that there would be narrow versus wide scale that you could identify with a particular movement of a song or something like that? Is that...
Yeah, so you'd be listening to these different Cantometric scales and then applying them on some sort of, I'm thinking it was probably like some sort of Scantron type sheet, because it was a punch card system that analyzed them. And yeah, that was kind of representing how you go across and enter those. I had a question about so you might listen to, you could listen to one poem for one scale, right? Could be interesting. Like you could do a whole, whereas this is trying to do everything. Like you could have 37, not all of them apply to everything. Like there are scales for like instrumental music in here, although most of it's song related. So not every scale applies to every kind of music, but certainly you could have cases where you have 37 factors to add. So yeah, so that was kind of the idea.
So you mentioned that the record of this was impressionistic in terms of what people were listening for and how they heard it. Are there degrees to which this particular kind of listening, so wide and narrow, for example, is quantifiable and as data, as audio data? Like, would it be possible to have an automated tracking of wideness and narrowness, I wonder? In other words, do Lomax's charts translate potentially into different kinds of spectrographic analysis or different forms of automated analysis that could be used?
I think to some extent, yes, and definitely for things like timbre. But I was looking into this because I think a lot of this has to do, so things like melody and rhythm, we have pretty good ways of tracking that. As far as I'm aware, I'm mostly aware from the music information retrieval side. You can track a pitch. That's not very hard to do. Of course, people's speaking voices are going to be in a particular register based on various factors. Many of those are cultural as well, about how high men's voices are, for example. There's all those talk about things like vocal fry, which are extremely gendered critiques of how young women in particular talk, that most linguists would say is complete garbage because they're descriptivists. They don't kind of pass judgment on, they're not prescriptive in how they make these judgments. So I think you could look at these and compare them over time. But I was looking into timbre in particular. That's one that I think has not a lot of attention has been paid as compared to things like melody, rhythm, harmony. At least in a musical context, timbre is a little more elusive. And then I guess where's the benchmark for those? But that would be really interesting to try these, right? To try to actually quantify it in sort of with the tools we have now. I'm just monitoring the chat here. Yeah, obviously, very raced and gendered these ideas of, and his scales too. It's interesting sometimes, what aspect becomes primary versus like what becomes number one versus what becomes number five, I think is interesting. And I think it's probably, unconsciously at some of his judgments about music and society that he had at the time he wasn't thinking of. So like, for example, like I think the default is seen as like the mid for like vocal width is compared to American speech in 1976, right? So that's assuming that that's kind of normal, right? And then that the extremes are the extremes. But if you look at listen to different languages, obviously that's just relative to, totally just relative to sort of an American conception of that. And that's interesting, Stacey. Similar claims have been made about women's speaking voices around pitch. I don't know, would you want to talk about that? I'd be kind of interested to hear more about that.
Sure, yeah, I can talk a bit about that. So my background's radio and podcast research, and kind of wrote a book all about, it's kind of a pop book all about gender voice and voice in broadcast. And she references quite a few research studies that have been done in the past few decades, looking at the varying pitch in women's voices across different societies, and how there's been claims made that in societies such as Japan, where women's voices are high, we can make correlations around power dynamics, and how voices mimic whoever has power in those societies, and how pitch relates to ideas of submission and masculinity and femininity, in contrast to North America, where we find vocal fry as a large phenomenon now, and how that is often getting related back to claims of women's psychology and the ways in which we're trying to attempt a voice as close to masculine and power as we can understand within North American society. So yeah, that's kind of where that comes from.
Thank you. And just to reply to Tomasz too, so Alan Lomax's daughter owns all the copyright to his recordings and Cantometrics, and runs something called the Center for Cultural Equity. And you can listen to some of his field recordings there. And they looked on their website that they're trying to release these digitally at some point. Probably going to try to monetize it in some way, I imagine, or make it a subscription service. But yeah, it'd be great, I think, to like some of these tapes. The tapes I have are library copies, right, that are not in great shape, probably because they were assigned to students to go into the library and listen. And particularly, just judging by some of the tapes, I have a feeling that the ones that were picked were played quite a bit. So yeah, it'd be nice if this were, made in digital form. And there's been interesting experiments out there too with it, sort of using modern tools. One is called CantoCore, which was sort of a new version of Cantometrics that was developed by, I think, music cognition researchers. And there's even someone trying to map Cantometrics to the genome, which I think is really pretty wacky, but pretty interesting as well. So yeah, I don't know, do we have maybe time for one more, or we could just leave it for discussion? What do you think?
Well, I just have one quick question, but I'd love to hear one more. But the question that continues, Tomasz, is it seemed to me that the punch card thing, that was used really for folkloric field research, right? So the idea would be that people go out into the field and then analyze them. So is there a whole storehouse of these cards filled out, somewhere, a part of the Lomax collection that could be digitized and studied, if only for like what people were perceiving when they were doing this field work,
Yeah, I think so. And it's either, yeah, with that Center for Cultural Equity, or I think Library of Congress has a lot of Alan Lomax. I think the Cantometrics project has some, because I think that was one of those big, like big science projects, right? That was funded, had huge amounts of funding from various levels of government. So I think it might have ended up there, had lots of participants in the project. So yeah, it'd be great if they released the data open. That would be my preference, so people could play with it. And I think Michael Frischkopf, who's an ethnomusicologist at U of A, had asked, he had a contact with Alan Lomax's daughter, I think via U of A used to have a relationship with Smithsonian Folkways, and he wanted to do some experiments on this. So I don't know if he got very far. They think they wanted to license a lot of things to him, but yeah, I think this would be neat, even just to see it as a project in time, right? Not
yes,
necessarily
exactly.
to try to apply it to something now, but to see, yeah, what were people's assumptions at the time. And yeah, the book, if you can get your hands on Cantometrics in your library, it's really, really interesting to read. And if you can listen to the tapes too, because this is just the tip of the iceberg, I think, in what we've been listening to.
And there's just a request about the website that you had mentioned, if there's...
Yeah, I think it's just for Cultural Equity. Let's see if I can pull that up. Association for Cultural Equity, sorry. And they've made some recordings open and available, but not others. And there's the whole global jukebox you can play with there, which is kind of neat. Let's paste that in. We want to listen to some glottal.
I think there was a split vote on glottal versus accent. I don't know. Do you want to take that?
Nick wants, okay.
Nick
so,
is very into it. Oh yeah, and Stacy
okay,
definitely
we'll do
wants
glottal. We
to.
got 2 votes for glottal, so glottal has beat out accent. So let's see.
Glottal. The singer you've just heard was ornamenting his song with glottal trills, produced deep in his throat. The next man can limit his glottal ornaments to 1 or 2 notes in a kind of glottal stroke. On the island of Ibiza off the east coast of Spain, all traditional songs are ornamented, line by line, with glottal shaking. The singers who can't produce glottal shake naturally take their Adam's apple in their fingers and shake it to produce the sound. That song was an example of level 1 on the scale of glottal shake, much glottal. Now for an example of level 2, some glottal. These are the cases where strong glottal notes are occasionally to be heard. Now an example of level 3, little or no glottal.
She got up behind him and away they did go. She got up behind him and away they did go, over the hills to the mountains so low.
Since glottal ornamentation is produced deep in the throat and with heavy accent, it's often a noisy style, like this example that's typical Siberian singing, performed here by an Ainu woman. An example of level 1, much glottal. Are you ready for the test? Then rate the following 6 songs as to levels of glottal shake on the 3-point scale.
So let's picture Jason making a series of this for audio text and having tests and everything.
That's right. Who's the most glottal poet of the 20th century? It's like...
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I forgot to mention is there was also a system developed at the same time called choreometrics. So this system was applied to dance as well, this kind of culturally comparative system. So yeah, it's interesting to think of how it could be expanded out, or even just thinking of what kind of sonic factors Lomax had come up with from all this experience around the world, listening to all kinds of music, how you might use that in listening to audio text, right? And how you could take some things from it. The idea of the scale, I think, is particularly interesting to me, because I would often think of a lot of these things of, oh, that's a nasal speaker, right? I wouldn't think of, oh, it's much nasal or whatever, right? So I would think of kind of it as a totalizing factor, but it's interesting to do it on that scale portion. So yeah. And just a comment here from Catherine. Yeah, thinking of what we were listening to, it is interesting to listen to the examples as excerpts. Yeah, close listening that really highlights one particular element. That would be different from hearing the entire piece. Yeah. Reminds me of the elocutionary instructional recordings, or another kind of educational recording. Yeah, those are great. The accent recordings. The point has been made already, but now that we've listened to a few of these, we are understanding the format. Now the rating system, it really takes it out of context. Is that Christian Bach who's mapping it to the genome? Yeah, it might be.
It is, yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
well, he's doing that with poetry, but I don't know about with.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, big data project, right? So interesting to look into.
Thanks, Mike. So how many of the categories are physiological in the ways that sort of glottal and wide and narrow, like that are really about particular use of the apparatus? Are any of them more sort of culturally informed? Well, they're all culturally informed, but like not just based on positions of the vocal apparatus. Yes.
Let me just have a look at the, yeah, there's sort of a summary page of all the lists. Yeah, I kind of narrowed in on ones that I thought would be interesting for this group. Yeah, so I mean, there's some higher level ones that are like social organization of the vocal group. So how I thought that doesn't necessarily apply in this context so much because this is group singing, right? So how much solo, essentially how much solo singing is there, or things like rhythmic relation of the vocal group to the orchestra. So how does the vocal how do the vocalists relate to the instrumentalists? Yeah, so some of them are kind of like about that social level. And then, yeah, it's textual things like we talked about, rhythmic relationship within the vocal group. So some of them are less kind of individual, but things like melodic shape, melodic form, phrase length, number of phrases, interval size, which in speech I don't think would be necessarily huge variance. Things that don't necessarily fit like polyphonic type. But then there's lots. So a lot of it I'd say is body is related to how you're producing those sounds vocally. And things like rasping, glissando, melisma. So, but my question was too, how much does this apply to poetry, right? Because it's easy to think of, especially looking at 4,000 audio recordings of music, you can find examples of all kinds of things, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think as a descriptive vocabulary, it's totally evocative. I mean, and I think in some ways, interestingly applicable. I think we're constantly discovering how the paucity of our vocabulary for describing sound and describing also vocal actions in literary studies anyways. There's linguistics has a much richer vocabulary, and I guess folklore studies does as well, obviously, because of Lomax. But these are the examples we need to sort of think about, I guess, and draw upon to some extent. I don't know of anyone who's done a sort of straightforward application of it to sort of literary performance yet, but I think it's a really potentially fascinating project. So we're a little after
thanks
5.
Everyone for listening. Yeah.
I want to thank Sean for an amazing listening practice, bringing some great sounds and great context for us to think about those sounds. So thank you very much, Sean. And
thank you, Sean. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming. And I think this may be the last listening practice of 2020, and we have a lineup in forming as we speak for the new year. So we'll see you again in 2021. If there is one that does come up before January, we will let you know, just let you know. And for those of you who are Spoken Web members, including you, Ian, if you're interested in running, guiding a listening practice, please get in touch with us, because that's definitely something we'd be interested in. So thanks, everyone, and have a great evening or afternoon, depending where you are.
Thank you.
Bye.